Drone footage is great, but it has a tendency to stick out of your video like a sore thumb. So in today's video, I wanted to show you a bunch of different tips and techniques for editing your drone footage. You're not gonna have a good edit without good footage, so I wanna first take a second to talk about the settings you should be using on your drone. The DJI app actually gives you a lot of control with manual settings on your drone, so I'm gonna go in there and turn off the automatic exposure entirely and instead use the shutter speed and ISO to set the exposure for the shot. Depending on the environment you're shooting in, you might be cranking up that shutter quite a lot, which will result in your footage having little to no motion blur, and you can fix this by having an ND filter on your drone, but a lot of us, including myself, don't have that, so we're gonna fix it later. In addition to using those manual settings, I'm also gonna set a flat picture setting on the drone by turning the contrast and sharpness all the way down. I do this to preserve detail for the edit. You can always add contrast and sharpness in post, but once the drone or camera adds them in itself, you can never take it away and get that detail back. Finally, just be aware of the white balance that you're shooting with. Make sure that it's accurate to the environment you're filming in and that it matches every other camera that you're shooting with. Because we're shooting with those settings, it's going to be a lot easier to edit the drone footage, and the first thing I'm gonna do is color correct it to match my camera. Since I'm constantly switching between footage from my drone and footage from my camera, it's important that they don't look completely different. For example, my camera has a bit more of a cool tint than the drone, which has a warmer tint. So before I do any other editing, I use curves to account for the changes. I'll adjust the lighting and the tones in the image. So because the footage from my drone is a bit warmer than that of my camera, I might add a bit of blue in and take out a bit of red. And this doesn't just apply to editing drone footage. You could use these same techniques when editing footage that was shot at different times of day or different lighting conditions. Now that we've done that, we can jump into our actual color grade, and I'm gonna go over this briefly in this video, but if you want more information about the steps and techniques I'm using, I made a separate extended video all about my color grading process that you can check out by clicking right up here. The first tool I use is curves. I raise the black point and lower the white point a bit to give the footage more of a film look, and then I'll usually add some contrast in depending on the shot. Next, I use a hue saturation adjustment to shift the individual colors around in the image. What I usually end up doing is desaturating green and yellow, then saturating red and shifting the blue tones to more of a turquoise color. And finally, for a bit more color contrast, I'll use yet another curves effect to add those teal shadows into the image. One final effect I like to add to drone footage is this diffused highlights effect. I made a separate video all about it that you can click by watching right there, but basically what this does is smooths out the highlights and gives them a bit of a glowy effect. And I like to use this on all of my footage, but especially drone footage, because it kind of helps to take away that sharp, harsh look that you get in a lot of cases. At this point, we're completely done with the colors, but as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, you might end up with a shot that doesn't have any motion blur, and motion blur can be a really big factor in making your footage look very smooth and realistic. The easiest way to add some motion blur to your footage in post is by just dragging your software's motion blur effect onto your footage. This is basically just gonna add some completely fake-ass motion blur onto your footage. This effect might not be completely accurate depending on your footage, and in that case you can try using other effects like a zoom blur, radial blur, or angle blur, depending on the shot you're working with. And for the third time in this video, I'm gonna link you to a separate video if you want a bit more information about some techniques for adding motion blur in post. Click right there. When you're flying a drone, it's very important to make sure that you're keeping an eye on it and not being annoying or endangering anyone or anything else. Not just staring at the live view trying to get a cool shot. So if you're using your drone safely, you might not necessarily get the camera motion quite perfect straight out of the camera. Thankfully, most current drones give us quite a lot of flexibility in terms of having very high detail and a very smooth shot because of the gimbal. So you have a couple options for fixing up your camera motion in post. Because the 3-axis gimbal in the drone gives us such a smooth shot to work with, if the camera motion's too slow, you can easily just speed the shot up in post. You can also digitally scale in quite a bit and reframe the shot to hide something that you don't want to be visible, or to just get your composition a little bit more perfect. And you can even animate the scale and position to give your shot digital camera motions like this dolly zoom effect made by scaling the video out as the camera moves forward. So far this video has been mostly practical techniques, so I knew by the end of it I needed to show you something a bit more fun. So right now I'm going to show you how to add some fake clouds into your drone footage. You're gonna get the most realistic result by just flying your drone above the cloud level, but in most places the maximum altitude you can fly a drone legally is 400 feet, so just be cautious that if you do this, the FAA might want to have a word with you. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think the point still stands that you probably shouldn't do that. But what you can do is add them in post, like this completely lawful top-down effect that you might have seen in some of Andreas Him's videos. Just find a cloud element online, one that's legal for you to use, of course, then just drop it over your footage, use a luminance key on it, and then blur it out a bit and drop the opacity. If the camera is moving in your footage, you can track a couple points on the ground, then attach that track to a point layer, and finally, parent your cloud layer to that point. Then just move the clouds a bit closer to the camera to create that parallax. This effect looks really cool, but the one that I prefer to use is one that I used at the end of my 2018 recap, where the drone flies off into a cloud and just kind of slowly fades away into it. Basically what I did was use the eyedropper tool to select a color of a cloud in the background of my shot. Then I created a new plane or solid layer in the color that I selected, masked a giant blob shape in it that covered most of the frame, feathered that mask a ton, and then animated it over the shot to increase in opacity as the camera moved away. This effect is much more subtle than the first one I showed you, but it's a great way to add a little bit of subtle depth into your footage or reveal a location. But that's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this video or learned something from it. And if you did, do feel free to show your support by leaving a like on the video, sharing it with your friends, or even subscribing to my channel. I upload 2 new filmmaking tutorials every single week. But that's all for this one. Keep creating, and I'll see you in the next video.